Hi, how are you? I hope you're well. Joanne is my name, and we're looking at the menstrual cycle. Today we're looking at menstrual cycle. I'm called Bigaba Joanne. I work with the leading referral pharmacy in Uganda that gives value with values. Yeah, so welcome back to my channel, and thank you so much for subscribing. So menstrual cycle. So I'll start with what menstruation is. Menstruation is the shedding of the lining of the uterus. So menstruation is the shedding of the lining of the uterus or endometrium that's accompanied by bleeding. So this is when the endometrium sheds, which is the inner lining of the uterus, and the lining of the uterus, and which is accompanied by bleeding. So menstruation occurs approximately in monthly cycles. So that's why in Luganda they call it agenze mwezi. So it occurs in monthly cycles, and it occurs throughout a woman's reproductive age. Except during pregnancy. So usually it occurs during a woman's reproductive age, except during pregnancy. So menstruation, when does it begin? It starts at puberty. We looked at puberty in a video in a previous video. So menstruation starts during puberty at menarche, that's the onset of menstruation, and stops permanently at menopause. We define menopause as 1 year after the last menstrual cycle. So if it can be early or late. So it can be early menopause if it's 1 year. If you've not had a menstrual cycle for 1 year, we define that as menopause. So menstrual cycle normally ranges from about 24 to 38 days. So depending, some people have 24 days, 25. So but averagely it's between 24 to 38 days. Only about 10 to 15 percent of women have a cycle that's exactly 28 days. And usually when we are counting safe days and stuff like that, we take into consideration the 28-day cycle. Sorry about that. So only about 10 to 15% of women have a cycle that's exactly 28 days. At least 20% of women have irregular cycles. So it's for some people, you have a regular cycle when it's like every 24 days, that's regular. Every 25 days, that's regular. Every 26. But for some, about 20% of women, sometimes they have a 30-day cycle, sometimes they have 28. So approximately 20% of women have an irregular cycle. They have a longer, some others have a longer or shorter. So it's either less than 24 days or longer than 38 days than their normal range. So for some women, they usually have irregular cycles. The cycle usually varies the most in the initial stages. So they usually in the initial stages at the beginning of the periods, that's at menarche, you find that someone can spend months without having another period. But after some time, after like a period of 5 years or 3 years, that tends to normalize. The bleeding itself usually takes about 4 to 8 days. Menstrual blood, now this is a point to note. Menstrual blood, unlike any other blood, usually does not clot unless someone has heavy menstrual bleeding. So menstrual blood usually does not form clots unless someone is experiencing heavy bleeding. Okay. So the menstrual cycle is regulated by hormones. We have the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, the luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. The gonadotrophin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus. The follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are released by the pituitary gland. These luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are the ones that promote ovulation, that's maturation of the egg. They stimulate the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone stimulate the uterus and the breast to prepare for implantation or an incoming baby. So they luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone, which in turn prepares the uterus and the breast for implantation for an incoming baby. So the menstrual cycle, we're talking about the menstrual cycle. It has 3 phases. The first phase is the follicular phase. This is before the release of the egg. The second phase is the ovulatory phase, which is the egg release. Then the last phase is the luteal phase after the egg is released. So it's regulated by the luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and then estrogen and progesterone. Those are the main hormones that we interact with when we are talking about the menstrual cycle. Awesome. So the menstrual cycle begins with bleeding, which marks the first day of the follicular phase. So the very first day of the menstruation marks the first day of the follicular phase. When the follicular phase begins, the levels of progesterone and estrogen are really low. They are low. That's why someone bleeds. As a result, the top layer of the thickened uterus begins to shed, which we call the menstrual bleeding. So that's the first day. About this time, the follicle stimulating hormone levels will increase slightly. So about as someone is menstruating, the follicle stimulating hormone levels will release the hypothalamus will stimulate the gonadotropin releasing hormone will stimulate the release of follicle stimulating hormone. So the levels will increase slightly, which will stimulate the development of several ovarian follicles. About 3 to 30 follicles are stimulated to begin growing or developing. So these follicles, they are sacs filled with fluid. Each follicle contains an egg. So let me say it again. So on the first day of bleeding, there will be a slight increase in follicle stimulating hormone, which will lead to the development of about 3 to 30 follicles. Inside these follicles is fluid, but also inside it is the egg. Are the eggs that whereby one egg will grow later on and then be fertilized. So later in this phase, the follicle stimulating hormone levels will decrease. So they increase slightly, then they later on will decrease. Still we are in the follicular phase, and one follicle will continue to grow. This follicle that's growing will produce estrogen, and the estrogen levels will begin increasing. When estrogen increases, you'll find that there will be thickening and all those other things. So that one follicle continues producing estrogen, and the levels of estrogen increase slightly. The other follicles that were growing break down and die. So when the levels of estrogen are increasing, they will stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone and also prepare the uterus. So it will stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone. So on average, the follicular phase will last about 13 to 14 days. This is the longest phase and varies the most in length. It tends to become shorter towards menopause. So this follicular phase will vary in length. It's the one that usually varies, and it's usually long. So the luteinizing hormone will stimulate the dominant follicle, the one that was growing, to bulge from the surface of the ovary and finally mature. When it matures, it bursts open, releasing the egg. So the increase in luteinizing hormone will mark the beginning of the ovulatory phase. So we go to the ovulatory phase. So let me do a recap of the follicular phase. The follicular phase begins at the onset of periods, the first day of periods. Follicle stimulating hormone will be released. When it's released, the slight increase will lead to development of the follicles. About 3 to 30 follicles grow, and the follicles are fluid-filled sacs that contain an egg in them. Eventually, the follicle stimulating hormone levels begin reducing, and this leads to one dominant follicle increasing in size. The one dominant follicle begins producing estrogen, and when estrogen levels increase, it will stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone. Estrogen prepares the uterus and stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, and this will take us to the ovulatory phase. So the ovulatory phase usually lasts between 16 to 32 hours, and it ends when the egg is released. So luteinizing hormone levels will be released. So there will be a surge. About 10 to 12 hours after the surge in the levels of luteinizing hormone, the egg can be released. So yeah, the egg is released, and the egg is released about 10 to 12 hours after the surge in luteinizing hormone. That's why when someone comes and wants, we give ovulation test kits, which they should begin applying, they should begin using from about the 12th day, because immediately 10 to 12 hours after the surge, after the increase in luteinizing hormone, the egg will be released. And when the egg is released, it takes up to 12 hours and then it dies. So what happens is that sperm is able to live up to 5 days, between 3 to 5 days. So when the egg is released and finds sperm in, it's able to be fertilized. So the woman is supposed to time. So from the 12th day, usually you're supposed to check if there is a surge. That means in the next 12 hours, the egg will be released, and the egg can only last for 12 hours. So the egg usually is fertilized by sperm that it has found, because the 12 hours could be the 12 hours someone is at work. So that is a very important point to note. So 10 to 12 hours after the surge in luteinizing hormone, the egg will be released. So usually the surge is detected by the increase of the levels in urine. When there is presence of luteinizing hormone in urine, that's the ovulation test kit. We are able to see that there is a surge in luteinizing hormone, and therefore we know that within the next 12 hours, the egg will be released. Yeah. So sperm. If sperm is there 3 days before or 2 days before, it's able to find the egg there and fertilize it. So in each cycle, there are about 6 days in which a fertilization can occur dependent on the sperm. But if it was dependent on the egg alone, it would only be 12 hours. So thank God that it's when the sperm is there before fertilization can take place. So the actual number of fertile days varies from cycle to cycle for some people because of when the surge takes place and the egg and stuff like that. So on ovulation, some women might feel a pain on one side of the lower abdomen, whereas others do not feel any pain at all. So the pain is usually felt at the same side as the ovary that is released, but the precise cause of the pain is really unknown. For some people, there might be a slight bleeding, but it does not follow a particular order that, okay, this time it's going to be released, then this time is the other side. Because you find that when one side, maybe the tubes are tight, someone is able to produce eggs from one side. So it's not like this month is this side, this month is the other side. It doesn't follow a particular order and does not alternate every month. So then we go to the luteal phase. The luteal phase begins immediately after ovulation, and it lasts about 14 days unless fertilization takes place. So the luteal phase begins after ovulation and it lasts about 14 days unless fertilization occurs. It ends just before the menstruation period begins, and that marks the beginning of a follicular phase again and stuff like that. So in this phase, the luteal phase, the ruptured follicle closes after releasing the egg and forms a structure called, so after releasing the egg to go on for fertilization, the ruptured follicle will form a structure called the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum will produce increasing quantities of progesterone. The progesterone that's produced by the corpus luteum does the following. It prepares the uterus in case an embryo is implanted. So it will help to maintain the lining. It maintains the lining of the uterus. It causes the endometrium to thicken, filling it with fluids and nutrients to nourish a potential embryo. So as a function of the corpus luteum, it will maintain the uterine lining, but it also thickens the uterus, providing it with water and various nourishments for the growing embryo. Then it causes the mucus in the cervix to thicken, form like a plug, and this prevents further entrance of more sperm and also bacteria into the uterus. The other function of the corpus luteum, it will cause the basal temperature to increase slightly. So in the luteal phase, there is usually a slight increase in temperature, really. And this increase in basal temperature can be used to determine whether ovulation has taken place or not. During most of the luteal phase, the estrogen level is high, and also remember progesterone is high because the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. The increase in estrogen and progesterone levels will cause the milk ducts to increase in size and widen, so they dilate and widen, which may result in some of the breasts really swelling. You see it, I'm almost getting to my periods, my breasts are swollen. That's because the body was actually preparing for a baby, so that the milk ducts actually widen. It's an effect of the corpus luteum, an increase in progesterone and estrogen. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum after 14 days will degenerate, and when it degenerates, the levels of estrogen and progesterone will decrease. If the embryo is implanted, the cells around the developing embryo will produce a hormone called HCG that will help to improve the levels of progesterone until the growing fetus can produce its own hormones. So that's it about the menstrual cycle. So if in the luteal phase, if the corpus luteum will degenerate, and which will cause a sudden drop in progesterone, and this will lead, and also the levels of estrogen drop. This will lead to someone bleeding because the uterine lining will shed, because it's the progesterone that was keeping the uterine lining intact. If fertilization takes place, there will be formation of the human HCG, which will help to produce more progesterone, and thus maintain the uterine lining until the growing fetus is able to do that on itself. So that, in a nutshell, that's the menstrual cycle. Thank you so much. Bye bye.